The date is November 28, 1942. It is a Saturday night in Boston, Massachusetts. The city is alive with the nervous, frantic energy of a nation at war. The Holy Cross College football team has just pulled off a stunning upset against Boston College, and the streets are filled with soldiers, sailors on shore leave, and civilians looking for a release from the grim headlines of the Pacific and Europe. The Coconut Grove nightclub is the place to be. It is packed beyond capacity, a dimly lit labyrinth of faux tropical decor, rattan furniture, and low ceilings. At 10:15 p.m., in the downstairs Melody Lounge, a young soldier unscrews a light bulb to create some privacy for himself and his date. A busboy, ordered to fix it, lights a match to see the socket. In an instant, a spark ignites the decorative palm tree fronds, which are made of flammable artificial silk. The fire leaps to the satin ceiling cloth. Within seconds, the Melody Lounge is an inferno. The fire races up the stairs, feeding on the oxygen, moving faster than a man can run. The revolving doors at the main entrance jam with the crush of panicked bodies. It becomes the deadliest nightclub fire in history. 492 people die in the flames, the smoke, or the crush. But the horror did not end when the fire department put out the flames. Hundreds of survivors were rushed to Massachusetts General Hospital and Boston City Hospital. They were suffering from horrific burns, their skin charred, their lungs scorched. In 1942, for a burn victim, the fire wasn't usually the killer. The immediate shock might kill some, but for those who survived the first night, a silent, invisible executioner was waiting. The killer was Staphylococcus aureus. The killer was Streptococcus. The killer was infection. The doctors at Mass General, some of the best in the world, looked at the rows of bandaged soldiers and civilians with a sense of dread. They knew the timeline perfectly. They knew that within 48 hours, the bacteria that live on human skin and in the air would colonize the raw, exposed tissue of the burns. The wounds would turn septic, the fever would spike, the blood would poison, and the patients who had survived the hell of the Coconut Grove would die in agonizing delirium weeks later. There was no medicine in the standard pharmacopoeia that could stop it. They had sulfa drugs, but sulfa was weak against these massive infections, and it was toxic to the kidneys. They had antiseptics, but you couldn't scrub deep burns without killing the patient from shock. But that night, a secret convoy arrived at the loading dock of the hospital under military guard. It carried a small, unassuming supply of a mysterious, experimental yellow liquid. It was codenamed the mold. The liquid was so precious that the doctors' hands shook when they held the syringes. It was not officially approved for civilian use. It was a state secret. The doctors injected the liquid into the veins and muscles of the worst burn victims. They waited for the inevitable smell of rotting flesh. They waited for the fever. But the infection never came. The fever broke. The blackened wounds began to turn pink with healthy granulation tissue. Men who should have died were sitting up in bed asking for water. It was a medical miracle. But behind this miracle lay a terrifying secret that the public did not know. The liquid used that night in Boston represented nearly half of the entire supply of penicillin in the United States. To treat those few dozen burn victims, the government had drained the National Reserve. If a single division of Marines in Guadalcanal had been hit by a mortar attack the next day, there would have been nothing left for them. If a pilot had crashed in England, he would have died of sepsis. The drug existed. It worked. It was the greatest medical discovery in human history, but it was effectively impossible to make. The scientific consensus in 1942 was that penicillin could never be synthesized in large quantities. It was considered a biological accident, a finicky, unstable juice exuded by a temperamental mold that refused to grow in a factory environment. Producing enough to treat one single man required processing hundreds of gallons of mold soup in thousands of tiny, flat glass bottles. It was a process closer to medieval alchemy than modern manufacturing. The Axis powers knew about penicillin. Their intelligence services had read the early British papers, but the Nazi scientists ignored it. They concluded that mass production was a logistical fantasy, a waste of resources. They stuck to their synthetic sulfa drugs. They believed the Allies were wasting their time chasing a biological ghost. They were wrong. 2 years later, on June 6, 1944, Allied medics carried millions of doses of penicillin onto the beaches of Normandy. They had enough to treat every single wounded man, Allied or German. They had enough to treat the civilians. They had enough to treat the venereal diseases in the rear echelon. The question remains, how? How did the Allies go from a few teaspoons of precious liquid, so rare that it was recovered from the urine of patients to be used again, to a mass-produced industrial chemical in less than 2 years? How did they turn a mold that grew on cheese into a weapon that won the war? To understand this miracle, we have to look past the doctors and the biologists who usually get the credit. We have to look at a chemical engineer who looked at a rotten cantaloupe and saw the future, and a woman who designed a factory that functioned like a living organism.
To understand the scale of the victory, we must first understand the horror of the pre-antibiotic world. It is a world that is almost impossible for us to imagine today. Before 1940, biology was destiny. A scratch from a rose thorn could kill you. A blister from a new pair of boots could lead to amputation. A sore throat could turn into scarlet fever and stop your heart. In the First World War, the battlefield was a breeding ground for bacteria, and the doctors were helpless. Getting shot in the leg in 1917 didn't just mean a broken bone. It meant the terror of gas gangrene. The soil of the Western Front was rich with manure and farm fertilizer, which meant it was teeming with a bacteria called Clostridium perfringens. When a piece of shrapnel tore through a soldier's uniform, it drove that dirty fabric deep into the muscle. The bacteria, which thrives in oxygen-free environments, would wake up inside the wound. It would release toxins that killed the tissue, creating gas bubbles under the skin. The skin would turn black, then green. If you pressed on it, it would crackle like bubble wrap. The smell was described by nurses as sickly sweet, like rotting apples in a cellar. Once gangrene set in, there was no pill, no shot, no IV drip. The only cure was the knife. You had to cut away the rotting flesh until you hit bleeding, healthy muscle. Often that meant amputation. If the infection reached the blood, it became sepsis. The patient would go into shock, their organs would fail, and they would die. Doctors watched helpless as young, strong men died from minor injuries that today would be treated with a Band-Aid and a tube of Neosporin. They had antiseptics like iodine, carbolic acid, and Dakin solution, bleach, but these were surface cleaners. You could pour bleach on a table to kill germs, but you couldn't inject bleach into a man's veins. It would kill him faster than the bacteria. The medical world was desperate for a magic bullet, something that would hunt down and kill the bacteria inside the body without harming the human cells. The discovery of that bullet is one of the most famous stories in science, but it is also the most misleading. The popular myth goes like this. Alexander Fleming found some mold, realized it killed bacteria, and saved the world. But that is not what happened. In 1928, Alexander Fleming, a brilliant but notoriously messy Scottish biologist at St. Mary's Hospital in London, returned from a summer holiday. He found a stack of petri dishes he had left by an open window. One of them was ruined. A spore of mold had drifted in on the London breeze, landed on the nutrient jelly, and grown into a fuzzy blue-green clump.
Fleming noticed something strange. The bacteria Staphylococcus that covered the rest of the dish wouldn't grow near the mold. There was a clear halo around the fungus where the bacteria had dissolved like snow melting around a fire. Fleming identified the mold as Penicillium notatum. He realized it was excreting a mold juice that killed bacteria. This is where the myth says the world changed, but in reality, nothing happened. Fleming published a paper in 1929. The medical world yawned. The juice was incredibly unstable. It broke down in heat. It broke down in acid. It broke down in air. You couldn't isolate it. It was too weak to be useful in a human body. Fleming essentially gave up. For 10 years, penicillin was nothing more than a laboratory curiosity, a footnote in a journal that nobody read. The moldy discovery was ignored. The real story begins in 1939 in Oxford, England. As Hitler prepared to invade Poland, a team of scientists led by Howard Florey, an Australian pathologist, and Ernst Chain, a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, dusted off Fleming's paper. They decided to try to isolate the active ingredient. It was a nightmare. The mold was incredibly stingy. It produced penicillin in microscopic amounts, measured in parts per million. To get enough drug to treat a single mouse, they had to brew gallons of the mold broth. Their lab looked less like a cutting-edge medical facility and more like a moonshine distillery in the backwoods. They grew the mold in anything they could find: milk churns, bedpans, biscuit tins, and even bathtubs. They turned the Oxford Pathology Department into a factory of glass bottles with tubes and pumps running everywhere. But it worked. In May 1940, they infected 8 mice with a lethal dose of streptococci. They gave 4 of them penicillin. By the next morning, the untreated mice were stiff and dead. The treated mice were alive, eating, and healthy. It was proof. But mice are small. Humans are massive. To treat a human, they needed thousands of times more drug. The first human trial in 1941 was a tragedy that proved the logistical crisis. The patient was Albert Alexander, a 43-year-old policeman. He hadn't been shot. He had scratched his face on a rose bush while gardening. The scratch had turned into a massive cascading infection. His eye was swollen shut and oozing pus. His scalp was covered in abscesses. The infection had spread to his lungs and his blood. He was dying.
Florey and Chain brought their entire supply of penicillin, everything they had painstakingly brewed for months in their bathtubs and bedpans. They injected him. The effect was Lazarus-like. Within 24 hours, Alexander sat up. His fever dropped. The swelling in his eye receded. He began to eat. It was a miracle. Then the supply ran out. The scientists were so desperate to keep him alive that they collected Alexander's urine, brought it back to the lab, recrystallized the penicillin that his body had excreted, purified it, and injected it back into him. They were recycling the drug through the patient's own kidneys. But it wasn't enough. The supply hit zero. The infection roared back with a vengeance. Albert Alexander died. He didn't die because the medicine failed. The medicine was perfect. He died because of logistics. He died because you could not fight a war with bedpans and milk bottles. The Oxford team realized that to treat the millions of soldiers who would soon be fighting in Europe, they would need thousands of tons of the drug. But their surface culture method, growing mold on top of liquid in glass bottles, was impossible to scale. Penicillin is an aerobic mold. It needs air. It only grows on the surface of the liquid. If you pour it into a deep tank, the mold at the bottom suffocates and dies. So to make more penicillin, you couldn't build bigger tanks. You had to buy more bottles. To produce enough penicillin for the war effort using the Oxford method, you would need a factory the size of Manhattan filled with billions of milk bottles, manned by an army of people manually harvesting the mold from each one. It was impossible. And Britain, under the Blitz, with German bombers pounding London every night, didn't have the resources to try. So in July 1941, Howard Florey and his colleague Norman Heatley did something dangerous. They took a small amount of the mold spores and smeared them into the lining of their coats so they could smuggle them out if the Germans invaded or if their plane crashed. They flew across the Atlantic to the United States. They arrived at Peoria, Illinois, at the doorstep of the USDA's Northern Regional Research Laboratory. They were begging for help. They needed American industrial might. The Americans had two things the British didn't: corn and deep tanks. The scientists in Peoria, led by Dr. Robert Coghill and Andrew Moyer, made the first breakthrough. They were experts in fermentation. They realized that the mold grew faster if you fed it corn-steep liquor, a useless, sludgy byproduct of the milling process. Peoria had oceans of the stuff. It was usually dumped in the river.
When they fed the British mold this corn sludge, the yield of penicillin jumped tenfold. The mold loved the corn sugar and nitrogen. But it still wasn't enough. The Oxford mold strain, Penicillium notatum, was weak. It was a wild strain, unsuited for industrial life. They needed a super mold. The U.S. Army Air Forces began a global treasure hunt. They instructed pilots flying cargo planes from India, China, and Africa to scoop up soil samples and fly them back to Peoria. They were hoping to find a strain of penicillin in the jungle soil that was more aggressive. But the super mold wasn't in the jungle. It wasn't in China. It was in a grocery store in Peoria, Illinois. A lab assistant named Mary Hunt, famously nicknamed Moldy Mary, was tasked with scouring the local markets for rotten fruit. She would buy moldy cheese, old bread, and rotting vegetables. One day in 1943, she brought in a cantaloupe covered in a pretty golden mold. It was Penicillium chrysogenum. When the scientists tested it, they were stunned. This cantaloupe mold produced 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original strain. It was a powerhouse. And when they blasted it with X-rays and UV light to mutate it further, they created a monster strain that produced 1,000 times more drug than the British original. Now they had the food, corn steep liquor, and the engine, the cantaloupe mold, but they still had the bottle problem. They were still growing it in shallow pans. It was too slow. The War Production Board in Washington issued an ultimatum. We need mass production, and we need it before the invasion of Europe. We need deep tanks. This is where the baton was passed to the true unsung hero of the story, Margaret Hutchinson Rousseau. Margaret Rousseau was a unicorn in 1940s America, a female chemical engineer with a PhD from MIT. She was working for Pfizer, then a small chemical company, not a pharmaceutical giant. Pfizer had made its fortune making citric acid for soft drinks using deep tank fermentation, a process where mold is grown in giant vats, not bottles. The government asked Pfizer, "Can you do this for penicillin?" The scientists said no. Penicillin is too fragile. It needs air. If you put it in a 10,000-gallon tank, you have to pump air into the bottom to bubble up and keep the mold alive. But pumping air into a tank introduces bacteria from the atmosphere. And if a single rogue bacteria gets into the tank, it produces an enzyme called penicillinase that destroys the penicillin instantly.
He was an engineering paradox. You need massive amounts of air to keep the mold alive, but the air carries the bacteria that kills the drug. Marguerite Rousseau didn't accept the paradox. She looked at the blueprints and designed a plant that functioned like a surgical theater on an industrial scale. She designed a system of deep tank fermentation that was terrifying in its complexity. It involved massive 10,000-gallon tanks with complex agitators to mix the corn-steeped liquor. But the genius was in the air system. Rousseau and the Pfizer engineers designed a way to sterilize the air before it entered the tank, scrubbing it of all bacteria using complex filtration and heat. It was a feat of plumbing and filtration that had never been attempted. It was a massive gamble. Pfizer bet its entire fortune, millions of dollars, on Rousseau's design. If the contamination got in, they would just be brewing 10,000 gallons of useless, rotten corn sludge. In the spring of 1944, they flipped the switch on the Brooklyn plant. The air hissed into the tanks. The agitators spun. The golden mold from Mary Hunt's cantaloupe, fed by the corn liquor from Peoria, swirled in the dark. When they drained the tank, they didn't get a teaspoon of drug. They got pounds of it. Rousseau's design worked. She had turned a biological accident into an industrial process. The price of penicillin collapsed. In 1940, the penicillin required to treat a single patient cost the equivalent of $30,000 in today's money. It was literally more expensive than gold. By 1944, the cost had dropped to almost nothing. The drug was no longer a jewel, it was a commodity. As the date for Operation Overlord, D-Day, approached, the American pharmaceutical industry was running 24 hours a day. The yellow magic was packaged into millions of glass vials. On June 6, 1944, when the ramps of the Higgins boats dropped on Omaha and Utah beaches, the medics rushing into the surf carried morphine, bandages, and penicillin. The difference was stark. In World War I, the death rate from infected wounds was nearly 18%. If you broke a femur in a trench, you had a high probability of dying from sepsis. In World War II, thanks to penicillin, the death rate from infected wounds dropped to near zero. Soldiers who suffered horrific shrapnel wounds, burns, and fractures, men who would have been written off as expected to die in 1918, were given a shot of the mold juice.
The bacteria Clostridium perfringens, the gas gangrene that had terrified a generation of soldiers, was rendered impotent. The sickly sweet smell of rotting flesh that haunted the hospitals of the Great War vanished from the wards of WW2. But the impact wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Every soldier knew about the magic drug. It gave them a sense of invincibility. They knew that if they could just get off the battlefield alive, the doctors could save them. They wouldn't rot to death in a bed. The Germans, meanwhile, were still relying on sulfa powder. Captured German medics were often found with supplies that were primitive compared to the Allied kit. When German soldiers were captured and treated in Allied field hospitals, they were often stunned by the American miracle drug that healed wounds their own doctors would have amputated. Penicillin also solved a problem that the generals didn't like to talk about – venereal disease. In every war in history, armies have been decimated by gonorrhea and syphilis. In WW1, the U.S. Army lost 7 million man-days to VD. It took weeks to cure gonorrhea with painful treatments that sidelined soldiers. Penicillin cured gonorrhea in 4 hours. It kept the Army on the line. It was a logistical force multiplier that the Axis could not match. By the end of the war, the U.S. was producing 650 billion units of penicillin per month. The moldy discovery the doctors had ignored for a decade had become the most important strategic material after the atomic bomb. The legacy of this logistical triumph is hard to overstate. It didn't just win the war, it created the modern world. Marguerite Rousseau's deep tank fermentation process is still how we make antibiotics today. It is how we make insulin. It is the foundation of the entire biotechnology industry. Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Chain were awarded the Nobel Prize in 1945. They deserved it. They found the key. But the people who built the door and kicked it open were the engineers. It was the bathtub brewers of Oxford who proved it was possible. It was the scientists in Peoria who found the food. It was Moldy Mary who found the engine. And it was Margaret Rousseau who built the machine. They took a spore that drifted through a window by accident and turned it into a shield that protected the free world. Before penicillin, biology was destiny. If the bacteria wanted you, they took you. After penicillin, humanity fought back. The lesson of the penicillin project is that discovery is only the first step. The brilliance of Fleming was useless without the scale of Rousseau. The genius of the idea means nothing without the logistics of the execution. In the end, the war against infection wasn't won by a doctor in a white coat holding a petri dish. It was won by a chemical engineer in a hard hat standing in front of a 10,000-gallon tank brewing the elixir of life. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of medicine and war, hit that subscribe button. Click on this to watch our next video. You don't want to miss it. This is the World War II Archives.